Welcome to Every Night is Game Night, because we all love game nights with our family and friends. But when you play solo games, then every night can be a game night. Check us out along with other great podcasts at dicetowernetwork.com.
Every Night is Game Night, episode 174, Review and History Chat, Days of Ire and Knights of Fire. Yo, my peoples, what's up? Welcome back to Every Night is Game Night, the podcast that helps you get your head in the game. This is Jason.
And this is Liz.
And this is Liz. Oh man, she is in the co-host chair. Welcome back to the show, Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire.
You know I love to be on here.
You have answered the call. We did one of these history chats before for the game Lisboa. It was exclusive to BeyondSolitaire.net. Go ahead and check that out. We have about 10 billion views for that history chat episode. Just go ahead, take my word for that one. We are coming at you with another history chat, this time for two very fun games, Days of Ire and Knights of Fire. And since we haven't talked about those games on the show before, we're going to review both of those games. They are both games that are based on the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. You know, Liz and I are giant history nerds. Right, Liz? History nerd?
You know it. Absolutely. even about history that I didn't know anything about before I played the game, which is the case here.
Neither of us are anything close to experts in Hungarian history. I know a little bit just from knowing American history. I'm a big American history student. Liz, you are a book hound. I think you're reading a book about the Hungarian Revolution right now.
That is true. I'm reading a book that is called The Bridge at Andau. It's by James Michener. And it's got kind of a novelistic vibe, and it is a nonfiction book that collects a lot of accounts of people who fought in the Hungarian Revolution. It does a good job of sort of capturing the oppressive atmosphere that the Soviets created there.
But don't you worry, guys. We are not going to bog you down in nerdy faux scholarship. We are going to give you gaming chat right up front of these two games, both cooperative games or one verse mini games, depending on how you want to play. We're Beyond Solitaire and Every Night is Game Night, so we are concerned with solo and co-op here. So that's what you're going to get for the most part. And after we talk about the games themselves, we will get into talking about some of the history stuff. So sound like a plan?
Absolutely. But never let it be said that my scholarship is faux.
I will take on the faux for the both of us. All right. So first of all, we are going to get into gaming chat. We'll start with Days of Ire. So Days of Ire was designed by David Turczi, published by Mr. B Games. This game came out in 2016. I remember playing it at the time. I really enjoyed it. So when Knights of Fire came out, the Kickstarter delivered, and I knew Liz was getting some copies. I was really excited to take it out again. So Days of Ire is a fully cooperative game set in the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. You are playing a collection of revolutionaries. They are young students, but they're also clergy and politicians and all sorts of other societal elements that were in Hungary in 1956. And you are resisting both the Soviet presence and also Hungary's own police state. You will resist within the game. You have a little pawn on the board, and you are traveling to different areas in Hungary, recruiting helpers, playing cards, and dealing with events on the board. So the events add a lot of historical flavor. You can do fun things like pull down Stalin's statue from the center square and drag the head through the streets. A lot of events. I think that's one of the event chains, like some of the events chains. So like you can, like if you have done the pull Stalin statue down, you can do the drag Stalin's head through the street event. Right?
And the best part is they are real events.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you're doing that, and that's really what you're doing in the game is you're trying to move around these different areas, and there's cards that represent events that are on the different spaces. You have to kind of gather resources in terms of cards, play those resources. They're going to be like bullets and food, and so you're traveling from place to place. What gets in your way are the police forces, both the Hungarian police forces, the SPA, and the Russian tanks. They operate a little bit differently, but they're kind of getting in your way. The snipers follow you. They can shoot. They shoot, and they represent a lot of damage to you. The military, the militia, they're just a lot of them, and they get in your way. And so So you're dodging around these areas, and over the 7 days of the revolution, represented by 7 rounds, you have to accomplish a certain number of events. And there are no points in this game. It is a genuine cooperative game in the mode of a pandemic or a flashpoint or something like that. Either you win or you lose. You win by gathering a lot of events. You lose in any number of ways, a whole bunch of different ways.
Oh yeah. So yeah, it's I think the best part about the game though is it's such a tug of war between you and the Soviets where, you know, you're trying to clear events off the board. They're constantly adding more events. And yeah, dealing with the military aspects of things as well. So snipers especially are very irritating when you are trying to handle an event, but also trying not to get shot.
Yes. It's a small board. Like you're used to a pandemic type game where there's like 48 spaces, so to speak. Here you have 11. And they're very closely connected, so you're constantly on the move. Talking about the experience of the game, like where does this game put you theme-wise? You're constantly on the move. You're a revolutionary, and it's in the middle of an oppressive Soviet state, so you have to go from place to place to place. You can't just like do a bunch of actions. You get 4 actions on a turn in one space and deal with it. You have to move away from the sniper. They're always moving. The event deck is savage because you pull 4 events every turn.
Yes.
Some of them good, some of them bad, but they're always constantly changing the board state and usually putting militia in your way, putting another event in your way that's harder than the previous one. The game is always changing, and you have to just constantly, move around and do your thing. So,
although what makes it interesting is that you can adjust the tempo of the game. So if you get your morale and public support for you up, then you get to do a bit more, draw some more cards as a revolutionary. And you can limit the number of events the Soviets get to pull. Whereas if they have the tempo and they're the ones who are kind of carrying the momentum and feeling confident, then they do more to you and you have fewer resources to use to cope with it.
A much more active bad guy. Whether it's the Soviet player has a lot to do. I mostly play this game cooperative, so in terms of the automated, how much I think it's a General Zhukov deck. I think that's in Days of Ire.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. my fact checker over there is on the case. So then either the Zhukov deck is just, pumping out card after card after you. It just feels like the enemy in this game is doing a lot more. And I'm glad you mentioned that because that's probably to the benefit of the game, but also a little bit of a drawback to the game. It's beneficial because it's thematic. The SPA, police force, and the Soviets are different. So they react differently to you on the board. You get different rewards if you take out the SPA or you take out the tanks. And you want that frantic sense. You want that sense of like, okay, the board is totally against you. You have a lot of resources. You can just play cards to give you kind of extra actions. So you don't have just 4 actions in a move. You can play a bunch of cards and get like a whole lot done. Like you can really kind of do a lot in the board. But the board will undo a lot of that, and just every round is a whole new panoply of things to deal with and options and all that kind of stuff. Good because it's thematic and tense and whatever. Not so great because it's did you find it a little bit on the fiddly side?
Yeah, I did just a little bit. I mean, I enjoyed the game. I think the theme especially is great though.
Yes.
I think for me, the theme is more exciting than the actual gameplay. I'm actually surprised that you didn't love it more because it kind of reminds me so much of Pandemic, and Pandemic is your jam.
Oh, I love this game.
So Pandemic is not necessarily my jam. I would not call myself a Pandemic person, which I think also took me a little bit out of the immersion in Days of Ire. I like it. I think it's a very good game, but I think I'm more interested in what it feels like it should be than what it actually is. Does that make sense?
I really like it, actually. I'm only saying that. So I hadn't played the game in about a year and a half, and I took it out, and it took me a while to get used to the fiddle, to get used to the tanks acting differently than the militia, to get used to the 4 event turns and how much the board changes. And if I'm playing it with other people, it would have been this, and this, and whatever. It's just hard to kind of grok. But in terms of my own personal enjoyment and engagement with it, I like this game, and I'm keeping it around as an 8 out of 10 for me, which is very, very good. And I'm going to keep on coming back to it. It's just in terms of how other people, so I guess you would be in that same boat, would take this game. I'm kind of thinking about how they would react to it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I like it. I put it as 7.
Yeah.
So for me, it's good, but it's not earth-shattering.
So what's missing? What do you? I know I told you what I think is missing. What do you think is what would take this game to the next level for you?
I think for me, part of what it is that because the board state changes so drastically and sometimes in ways that don't totally make sense in terms of what you're doing in the game, I get a little frustrated because it feels like no matter how hard you plan or how hard you play with your cards, things can reverse on you within a turn.
Right.
It's and like, luck is part of games and that's fine, but I sort of feel like the game encourages you to do a lot of planning and do a lot of really wringing as much as you can out of those cards, only to make it feel like it wasn't worth it sometimes.
You can win. It's not like a difficult game. It's just,
no,
right.
It's not.
You go through the event phase, and the event phase just does a lot. And you have to almost like reset your brain every single round because so much has happened. And right. I could see that being, you want that tense feeling, but you want to kind of bring that tension about with like action, like actual board stating action. Like, in Pandemic, you get your epidemic phase that doesn't take long to resolve, and then you're back in it. Here yes. It's like, okay, card, and the board is attacking, and it's everything kind of feels different. So it's not bad. I think it's in service. I think it's in service of the theme. And because I like the theme and I like the pandemicness of it, it kind of comes together for me. I could see that being a little bit of a difficulty for others, but for me, I'm keeping it. I like it.
Yeah, I definitely like it. I don't know if I'm going to keep it.
Oh, I was going to say, I already have it, so.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you think about your own personal collection, right? For me, it's definitely like it. Definitely glad I played it. Not sure it's a keeper. Right. I did, however, really love the way the board is set up with the actual images of the locations where the events take place. The events themselves are really drawn from history. So when I was reading that book I mentioned earlier in the show, the events that I had played in the game came up, and I actually felt really excited in that sense of recognition.
Yep.
It's a game that's about something that I think is really important and kind of a neglected topic. And so for me, the game's real value is in its historical theme, and not so much. I mean, put a different theme on that game and I wouldn't be as excited about it.
Yeah, make it about like what's a cheesy fantasy theme or something.
Yeah, and I mean, nothing. Put a dragon on it and I'll probably buy it, but even I have my limits.
Yeah. All right, well, I like it a little bit better than Liz. Liz gives it a 7 out of 10. I give it an 8 out of 10. I'm really excited to keep on playing this game. It has a place in my collection. It is Days of Ire. So now, so that was 2016. Let's fast forward to 2019. Another game, the follow-up game to Days of Ire, published and landed from Kickstarter. It is Knights of Fire, and Liz is going to take you right through it. Where Days of Ire was the pandemic Jason candy game, Knights of Fire is a war game. So I'm going to let Liz go crazy on it. Go for it.
All right. So Days of Ire dealt with the first week of this revolutionary conflict, one that, at least short term, the Hungarians did win historically, in the sense that the Soviets did retreat for a little bit. However, they didn't stay gone. And so Knights of Fire deals with the return in the next week of the revolution, which is in November of 1956. And basically, it's a situation where you, as the Hungarians, are playing a side that cannot win, at least not in a traditional sense. The Russians are militarily superior, and they are going to crush you. So the goal of the game is to do the best you can, even though you're doomed. So you are trying to help as many civilians escape as possible. You're trying to delay the Soviet regiment's entry into the city, and you're trying to disable as many units as possible. And you have, little units that you deploy around the board trying to hold things off as much as you can. But you have very limited resources, and you don't get to just keep coming back. You're going to lose. Well, I mean, you're going to lose in the traditional sense. So you have to score a moral victory instead. So just like Days of Ire, there's a Soviet side that can be played if you're not doing a co-op version of the game. So you can either play solo or co-op against the Konev deck. So just like the Zukov deck, there's a Konev deck with its own rule set. There's also a one versus many version where you have the Soviets. But either way, the Soviets win by either arresting a bunch of civilians before they escape, killing all of you, the insurgents, or placing enough garrisons, I guess, at locations throughout the city that are of strategic importance.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's another one of those balancing acts, but it doesn't have that same, I need to go deal with an event, pandemic-y feel. It's much more of a move units around. You can have some units that are hidden. There's a number of different little spatial puzzles in the game.
It's an area game. Not quite area control because the Soviets are controlling. You can't kill them, but it's
right. You're
doing the same. Right.
Yeah.
Doing the same area control-y thing. So, one action you can do is you can rescue civilians, which is one of the main things you're going to do in the game is rescue these civilians. So what you want to do is you want to flood as many insurgents into a zone as possible, and then it increases your odds to be able to rescue that civilian, and then, once she was rescued, then move on and rescue somebody else somewhere else. So, you're controlling the flow of your troops like you would in a traditional war game.
Yeah, something like that. I would say, yeah.
Oh, I'm the expert in traditional war games. Believe me. Ho, ho, ho.
It's definitely got a light war game feel to it. Yeah, where you are managing your units, and it's very much a numbers game. There's different symbols on the pieces, just like there are symbols in the cards, and you're trying to collect the right resources in the right places to deploy at the right times.
Right. So, what do you think?
It's fine. I haven't played it enough.
It's fun. Oh, no.
I haven't played it enough times to give it a score. I'm still in my kind of mid-review phase. Does that make sense? So I've played it. I want to play it some more. I want to make sure. I think that I like it. I think it's good. It's maybe not quite as good as Days of Ire.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely different. If they weren't linked by the theme. And also the campaign, we'll get to the campaign in a second. You can play both of these games back to back. I'll get to that. They're very different games. You couldn't barely tell that they were kind of from the same world,
Yeah, I think part of what it is for me is that I feel like with the event cards and the images on the board, that Days of Ire is more immersive. And so the theme comes through a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that was such a key part of my enjoyment that Knights of Fire didn't feel quite as good.
Right. So yes, it is definitely a little bit lighter on the theme because it's more kind of focused on that wargaming aspect to it. I think I'm actually surprised I enjoyed this one a little bit more than you. This one's a 7 for me. I guess maybe I'm just not as much of a war gamer as I'm a cooperative gamer. I'm going to distinguish between the theme and the vibe. The actual theme of 1956 Hungary, maybe I didn't get that. But the vibe of being constrained, feeling hopeless, feeling like, okay, I did a bunch of things, they're great, but then the enemy turn goes and all the tanks are back and there's more garrisons over here. It's like, what am I doing? It definitely gave you that feeling of encroaching doom, claustrophobia, just in a general sense, and I enjoyed that. I enjoyed that this game is not like anything that I've played. I enjoyed that it put me behind the 8 ball, and I'm just doing the best I can with a bunch of bad options. And, I might have a good move here and there. I might be able to rescue a prisoner that I did, or a civilian that I didn't know I was going to rescue by being clever. So it at least delivers kind of that core gameplay and a good vibe, if that makes sense. So I was happy with that.
Yeah, and that I would agree with. I actually think it's interesting just as a game because there aren't very many games out there that you aren't playing to win, if that makes sense.
Right.
It's actually a pretty bold choice, I think, to design a game where you can't win, you can only lose better.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny. I was reading a review by Brian Train, the main designer, and David Turczi is also a co-designer, I should say. Brian Train being a GMT veteran, a wargaming designer veteran, so he kind of is responsible. He actually, Brian Train designed the predecessor of this game, which was called Operation Whirlwind, which is the Russian operation to retake Budapest. And so he was saying how I designed these simulations, and I needed help making it a game. So I can see where there's a lot of simulation here, and then some of the actual gamery, quote unquote, fun elements are grafted on, so to speak. Yeah. So I say that it's okay. The fun was grafted on, isn't baked into the game. That sounds terrible. It's a war game, and a lot of times war games when you make a war game, it kind of wants to speak for itself, and you don't want to like program in all the fun. It's like, okay, the fun is being in this time period and doing the things that the soldiers did or the insurgents did. So I guess my one difficulty with the game, main one, is the actions felt a little bit constrained, like the choices.
Yeah.
So you basically have 3 things that you can do. You can rescue a civilian.
Mm-hmm.
You can ambush the bad guy and like kind of take out, temporarily disable a tank.
Yep.
Or you can build a barricade. So you're doing one of these three things every turn. You go back and forth. You have like a bunch of turns to do things, and then the round kind of hits. But you're always doing one of those 3 things. A lot of times it's obvious. If there's a tank there and you see that the tank is going to activate in that zone, put a barricade. That's what I'm doing. Or if there is a 2-value civilian and it's close to the Soviets, I'm rescuing that civilian, and it's not really a choice. So it's like, that's what I'm doing. And I found that I was doing that obvious thing a little too often for my liking. I'm guessing you agree with that by what you're saying.
Yeah, and I mean, the game is still challenging. It's really hard to get the things that need to get done against overwhelming odds. But yeah, I don't often feel like there's... It feels like you pretty much know what you need to do.
Right.
It's just a matter of whether you're going to be able to do it.
Right. Exactly. So like, you need to rescue a prisoner. You need to set up a barricade because you can actually see a little bit of what the AI deck is going to do because some of the cards are face up, which is great from a strategy standpoint, but maybe not so great in terms of, giving you a feeling like you're free to kind of do more things because you see it, so you better do it.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Although, of course, this is the whole theme of these games is about constraint of freedom. I guess the question is, when you are playing a game, how much should you feel that?
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, is this game simulation or is it a game? It's an open question, and I think there's a lot of, in more than Days of Ire. Nights of Fire goes a little bit towards a simulation than a game. And is that good? I enjoyed it. I mean, it's not something that, like, if I'm going to play Days of Ire way more than I'm going to play Nights of Fire, but it doesn't make Nights of Fire bad. Nights of Fire, to me, is a solid game. It gave me a good, tense feeling. And did you play, I'm guessing you haven't played the campaign.
I've not, no.
Here's my favorite part. So if you play the expansion, there's another expansion you can get. I forget exactly what it's called, but it adds minis and it adds like a...
Oh, the Red Army?
Yes, the Red Army.
Yeah, I just haven't cracked it yet. I haven't ready to go. That's why I haven't read my review yet. So
it is, I thought it was really, it added another dimension that maybe you might be missing. So the quote unquote campaign is basically a set of rules that lets you play both games and it feels integrated, at least thematically. So then in Days of Ire, there are fighters that you can recruit. So like you have a fighter, but then you can recruit NPC fighters basically. So the Red Army gives you cards that represent the fighters that are in Days of Ire. So then once you have those cards, you can actually use those fighters in Nights of Fire to do Nights of Fire things. So as they die as they die in Days of Ire, those cards get taken out of the deck for Nights of Fire. So it's like, oh, I was looking forward to playing that, but he's dead. Oh. I laugh, but like just it's kind of brilliant. It creates like an extra level of emotional attachment, and it's not like a huge amount, but it was enough, because these guys have names, and the freedom fighters or the research that went into this game is so poignant. So, and it actually a game mechanical way of creating a little bit more attachment to it, which is really good. And then the other thing,
and I definitely get attached to people in games, so I'm a sucker for that sort of thing.
I think that you might really enjoy that then. And then the other thing that the Red Army does is in Days of Ire, you're going to have goals basically. And if you meet certain goals, then game status things change in Nights of Fire. So like if you meet the goal of, I'm going to make something up right now. Like if you pull down Stalin's statue, then in Nights of Fire, the Soviets get a debuff, something like that. So It gives you a little bit more attachment across both games. Again, they're very different games, but I really felt like that crossover deck really heightened my attachment and just a thematic overlay of the whole experience. So if you're going to play both of these games, absolutely get the Red Army expansion.
Nice. Yeah, I still need to play it, and it may affect my review scores. We'll see.
So that was our opinions on Days of Ire and Nights of Fire. That was our game opinions. So if you are here for game content, then you are good, and we will see you next week. All right. You think the gamers are gone? Can the history nerds come out?
Come out, history nerds.
Come. Bring your books. Bring your pocket protectors. All right. So let us get into our history chat. We're going to chat the history of the Hungarian Revolution, kind of articulating the overall broader context of the historical context of the Days of Ire, Nights of Fire kind of setting, and how the games both integrate some of the major events and all that kind of thing. So like last time, I'm more of a kind of big picture, let's talk about the context person, and then Liz is kind of reading up on some of the things that happened kind of in the moment itself. So I will give a little bit of context as to what was going on in the world. I know this is like World War II, so it's like, let me boil it down in like 7 minutes. Yeah, good luck to me. But yeah, so I mean, the story, so we're talking about the country of Hungary, and the capital city of Budapest being occupied by the Soviets. It's important to understand, kind of talk a little about the Soviets, because I think when it comes to the American context, we're both American, we think the Soviets and we think of like one thing. We think of the Cold War. We think of, like us versus them and everything. And it's really important to note that kind of at the time, during World War II and everything, we approach the Soviet situation a lot different than we do now. So the story really begins during World War I in 1917. So 1917 is when the Russian Revolution happens. The old guard, the old aristocracy of Nicholas II, the Romanov dynasty, it falls. It abdicates the throne, and it eventually opens the way. So the Russian Revolution happens in 1917, and our friend, head of the Bolshevik Party, Lenin, comes up, and he is ruling the country, and it is a completely different scenario. He is ruling on behalf of the people. It is a out and out socialist, communist, whatever you want to call it, revolution, the first of its kind, really, of a major power in the world. So why is it important to kind of point out that, that history that goes back? So first of all, I don't think that a lot of Americans know or really realize that Russia was our ally in World War I. And they dropped out of the war because they were getting, quite frankly, their butts kicked. And Lenin and the Bolshevik Party kind of step in and say, wow, we got to get out of this thing. Germany is doing its thing. It's really kind of taking us out. So it's like, okay, let's just get out of this, of the war, and actually do stuff for the people. So what Lenin does on the good side, which is why the people are kind of open to this whole Soviet thing in the first place, is they modernize. And Lenin nationalizes the farms, he nationalizes banks, he creates a lot of local control, he establishes orphanages, he establishes a social safety net. He actually does a lot of good in terms of the, lifting up the poor people of Russia. So that's why that movement kind of solidified. So that's the kind of public good face that the Soviets are kind of putting out there. But Lenin's not exactly great in terms of repression. So one of the things that Liz is going to talk about when we get to the actual revolution is very early on, the Soviets kind of developed this internal desire to repress class struggle, repress class enemies, the bourgeois, by violence. And it's a revolution that was born in violence. As soon as the revolution happened in 1917, you had a big civil war called the White Army versus the Red Army. And the White Army was kind of like always supported by the West, always supported by the, the capitalist bourgeois, blah, 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 according to the Red story. So never in their history did Russia know extended peace. It was always war. So they adopted, and Lenin was really on this. He really adopted kind of repressive tactics in order to kind of centralize power and, do what the Soviets had to do. Lenin started it. Stalin comes in power in 1924 and kind of pushes the gas pedal on all that. I mean, when you hear Joseph Stalin, you hear, nowadays we hear Joseph Stalin, we hear just total repression, total Stalinization, and where Lenin didn't really care on let's broadcast Russian culture. Stalin is okay, let's broadcast Russian culture all over our sphere of influence. He was a very, very kind of direct and brutal dictator. However, he's on our side in World War II. I didn't know if you knew this, but like at some point, because he was on our side in World War II, like some periodicals in America are calling him Uncle Joe.
Yes, I do remember that from history class.
Which is crazy.
It's totally wild. I mean,
Uncle Joe.
you think about, I mean, I guess every family has a really disturbing uncle, and we did that back then as well.
Well, I mean, it was mixed, right? I mean, so that's another part that we're going to get into in terms of the Hungarian Revolution. Like, this is all this happening, and I talked about all the state repression and the violence and the, silencing of dissidents and all that kind of thing. But like the West doesn't really know, like you hear stories, and there's obviously if you're reading up to it, but like the average person is just getting their news from, the regular news outlets. There weren't that many yet back then. There wasn't,
right.
Huge amounts of social media or even source of information. So because the Russians are our ally, and because they're, basically a world away, it was like, okay, they're doing their thing, we're doing our thing, even though all this repression is going on. And, so quote unquote, Uncle Joe, we're kind of on the ball with him. However, that falls apart fairly quickly. And, once the Germans or the Nazis are defeated, then the Cold War settles in pretty fast after that.
Yeah. And then, of course, the Iron Curtain comes down. It was so interesting with that phrase is that actually in that book I was reading, somebody was hired to translate documents from the West and actually got in trouble for using the phrase Iron Curtain.
Really? Okay. Like how so?
So as in it's capitalist propaganda about our lovely regime and you shouldn't be spreading it even if you're translating their work. I mean, yeah. So what's really fascinating about the Hungarian Revolution is that, we think about communism as a sort of monolithic thing, but a lot of the lead Hungarian revolutionaries were very devoted communists who really thought highly of the works of Karl Marx and who valued the worker and sort of the promises of a communist society. And then they come to realize that, all these sweet, sweet promises that the Russians are making are not really for them. So you end up in this situation where, there's all these people who are studying communism and they're going to communist book group and they take it really seriously, but then they're looking around at the world around them and the government that's in their country and they're starting to wonder, wait, why are these people here? If this is all about the worker, why have I been working for a year and I can only afford like 2 sets of clothes, which really did happen. Mm-hmm. And, why are all of our natural resources going to Russia? Why isn't anything staying in Hungary? Right. What's going on? And I find it really interesting that, we talk, when you look at communism, it's the worker, the most glorified member of our society, and then you end up with these extremely rigid hierarchies where only certain people have access to information, to books, to money. And the other thing that's really cool to me about the Hungarian Revolution is that a lot of the top revolutionaries were people who were benefiting from the Russian system and who were receiving rewards from Soviet Russia and who chose to do something about the Russians anyway.
Let's take a quick step back and talk about, because I talked about the Soviets. I just wanted to kind of articulate what Hungary was going through and how they got where they got. So Hungary, in World War I, Hungary was Austria-Hungary, and they were part of the Central Powers, and they were the losers in World War I. And Russia was on the other side. So Austria and Hungary eventually kind of dissolves and become 2 different countries, and they lose a lot of land. And if you know anything about your history, the Central Powers were forced to pay a lot of reparations, which is part of what sowed the seeds for World War II. So Hungary is on the receiving end of a lot of these losing all their land and having, a lot of, percentages, like big chunks of their GDP are flowing towards in reparations towards these other places. So Hungary is kind of like, they're starting to go through the same similar things as Germany of, okay, we're mad as heck. We're not going to take this anymore. So then what happens is a leader comes up, and it's usually like the charismatic leader that kind of guides these things in terms of this mid-century war. Admiral Miklos Horthy. He was a person who saw, Hungary was down, and then he saw the Third Reich was rising. So it's like, all right, the Soviets don't, or the the Russians don't care about us, the West doesn't care about us, but Germany's right here, and they are rising, so we're going to rise along with them. And one of the really ugly parts of Hungary's history was they were very active participants in the Holocaust. They took up a lot of Hungarian Jews, ended up in Auschwitz and, a lot of the different places like that. And so eventually they end up on the other side of the Russians again in World War II. So then Hungary's really up against it. So at some point during the war, Hitler and the Third Reich invade Hungary just to kind of take it over and, solidify their position over there, which all it does is invite Soviets to invade. And eventually, at the end of 1945, they are in the middle of occupying Budapest. So that's how they got there. And so Hungary is the unfortunate position of being on the wrong side of two different world wars when it comes to the Soviets. They're consolidating power. So what Liz was describing about how the Soviets were not very beneficial, well, they're occupying a country that has declared war against them twice. So it's not like there's a lot of love for the Hungarian state.
What's so interesting about that, though, is a lot of Russian soldiers who were stationed in Hungary did not have the heart to attack the Hungarians at the beginning of the revolution. They'd grown very fond of the people that they lived among. There's a whole lot of weird nuance in there, especially since by this time, everybody considered themselves communist. It wasn't, we don't want to be communist anymore, get out. It was, if we're really being communist, why aren't you being fair to us?
Right.
And
that was the whole thing about Stalin. So Stalin's version of communism was a cult of personality. Like, you need to be Stalinist communist and you need to speak Russian. And where Lenin didn't necessarily, he was oppressive and brutal, but he didn't necessarily need to export all of the Russian model to everything. Stalin definitely didn't, he didn't have any qualms about that. You are not a real communist unless you are following Stalinist communism with all the statues and all the, you have to speak Russian, which
yes.
if you want to just cheese off a populace, take away their language.
Oh, yeah. And the other thing that's interesting is that it goes all the way down to several levels. So somebody at a factory made an offhand comment about the Russians and they could disappear for reconditioning and then maybe come back a month later and not talk about whatever happened. Eventually the Stalinist occupation creates this society where you don't know who is ratting whom out to the government, but it's happening even over very offhand remarks. And you could just be a housewife who made some crack about Russia and disappear for a little bit. Mm-hmm. And it creates this sense of distrust and hatred and intensity that turns into the attack on the radio tower that ends up in Days of Fire.
Yeah, so then we get to 1956. By then, it kind of becomes what it becomes in terms of the battle lines being drawn. The Iron Curtain is up. NATO has been formed in the West, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which a lot of the Western countries have formed in order to resist Russian expansion. And no mistake, the Bolsheviks, they wanted to expand communism all over the world. So this is not a thing where it's let's revolt and then leave us alone. They really thought they were going to lead a worldwide worker revolution, throw away the capitalists and the bourgeois and all that. So the West is consolidating into an organization, and the East is as well. So Russia is trying to organize a bunch of states in the Warsaw Pact. And one of the countries that signs onto the Warsaw Pact is Hungary. So that does not make the Hungarians very happy. A lot of the populace, they desire neutrality. So some kind of neutrality, or if the Western is going to help them, then great. So once the Warsaw Pact gets signed, the battle lines are drawn, then, the Hungarians have a chance to kind of look at things and say, are we better off here? And like Liz was saying, worker, but I'm not working for anything. There's famine. You're centralized all the planning, but that doesn't result in more productive farms. I don't have anything to do. I don't have anything to eat. And there's a bunch of strikes that are happening. So I think in Poland, there's a very successful strike that happens the same year. So
yes.
Then that work...
Actually, a lot of Hungarian students started having meetings together to show solidarity with people in Poland, and then things started to go from there.
Right. So then in the satellite states, so you're talking Poland, talking Czechoslovakia at the time, talking Hungary, there's a lot of foment because they're so close, because they're in the middle zone. They're not near the center of Moscow, but Moscow is basically exerting power from the centralized way from so far away that a lot of these people are kind of thinking like, I'm communist too. Why do I feel like a second, third, fourth class citizen? So then we get to the days of the actual game, Days of Ire, October 1956. We're talking about the period between 23rd October and 28th October. It is, I don't want to go into too much of the detail because you can actually get a lot of the detail from playing the game, but a lot of like intimate things happen. And if you just read the cards and read the event cards and, the names of the fighters, you're going to get a sense for, what's happening. So when you were reading your book, what stuck out in terms of like what was in your reading and then how it matched up to the game?
A lot of events that appeared in my reading matched up to the game, and actually a lot of the discussion of destroying tanks showed up. So the Russian tanks were very intimidating, and it took a lot of personal risk and effort to dismantle them. And it was very interesting to read about how people managed it with very limited resources. I actually think too, one thing that the game captures is that there's lots of normal people who kind of get activated as fighters throughout the game. And, when I was reading some accounts of what had happened, there's all kinds of just, little boys stringing grenades across the street to help disable tanks. A lot of students, a lot of soldiers, it's amazing how young so many of the revolutionaries were. It was, and how I think that they didn't think it was going to turn out the way it did.
Yeah, it was something like 2,700 total people died in that week. 24% of them under 25 years old.
Yeah, it was a very young revolution because all of these people who were being indoctrinated by the Russian state and who were students, expected that the things that they were being taught would also lead to some sort of respect for them and for their ideas, and that did not happen.
Mm-hmm. So then we get through the week, and eventually what ends up happening, and so much of the fighting, actually there's a couple of things. First of all, so much of the fighting kind of centers around the radio tower, and there's a whole bunch of stories. Like you have to go ahead and read some articles that Brian Train has written and some of the other stuff about how just the radio became so important, and like, okay, we need this person to say this thing, or right now the radio was playing this song. I forget exactly what it was. It was like, as opposed to playing statist propaganda, the fact that they were playing the song was like, okay, something weird is going on here. Just the indication of a change in the messaging was enough to tell the people, okay, it's time to, something different's going on here. The other thing, and I got this from the appendix, was ambulances were targeted.
Yes.
And that's really that it was poignant for me. And this is kind of, I have a little personal story about this. So when I was younger, I studied abroad, and I was in Nepal. I was in Kathmandu, Nepal. And I didn't know this at the time, but there was on the countryside, so Kathmandu is the main city, but in the countryside was a revolutionary group called the Maoists. So the Maoists, communist Mao and everything. So at the day that I was supposed to fly out from my student thing ended, I was going to the next place. That day, apparently the Maoists were like hundreds of yards away from the city, and they shut the city down. So it's like, oh, how are we supposed to get to the airport and leave? They took us in ambulances. So we were there under the gurney with our bags, traveling with ambulances, and they were literally the only cars on the road. So that was scary, and I made it fine. There's a whole bunch of other stuff to the story. But just to underscore the point, when I was reading the part here about ambulances, I could totally see, an ambulance like screaming down and like, pretending that it needs to be somewhere, but really carrying either refugees or fighters or just like completely integrated into the war effort. And it was much more risky than you would think. Oh, it's an ambulance,
Yeah, and actually what's really interesting is there's an ambulance story that I read that when the radio tower was first attacked and there were, pro-Stalinist people inside that building, they sent an ambulance that actually had a bunch of weapons in it for them. And the people who had injured students and locals in the roads made the ambulance stop, thinking they would make the ambulance driver help their wounded. And then they found out that the ambulance driver was carrying a ketchup weapon.
So then, you go through the week, and week eventually ends with a moderated communist leader named Imre Nagy. He had been elected before, but then he was ousted by the pro-Soviet factions, and that was also a part of the tinderbox that made the revolution explode. But he comes back, and he uses the radio to announce, okay, ceasefire. Let's step back from this, and we have a bunch of demands, right? So we are going to establish peace. We're going to establish a multi-party democracy, not just Stalinist. We are going to declare Hungary neutral by withdrawing from the Warsaw Pact, and kind of put in some of the more moderate changes that Hungary has been asking for. People disagree. People wonder why the Soviets went from, okay, we're not going to do much here, to, okay, let's bring in the tanks. I think one of the reigning theories is that withdrawing from the Warsaw Pact was a bridge too far. Like, they could not let that happen because it was the Cold War. The world was bifurcating. If there was no true neutral states, really. And
right.
They were afraid, like the Soviets were afraid, that if they allowed Hungary to be truly neutral, then the West would just come in and regain influence and all that kind of stuff. So Nikita Khrushchev, who at this time wanted to be a different guy, he didn't want to be Stalin. Stalin dies in 1953, so Khrushchev comes to power, and he doesn't want to be Stalin. He wants, like, the exes of the Stalin are bad. We're going to de-Stalinize. We're going to take away the statues and close some of the gulags and release some of the people, have a little bit more freedom. Well, the response to the Hungarian Revolution, one of the big things that it did was kind of show, no, this is violence and repression and militarization. It doesn't matter who's in charge, whether it's Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, or whoever. This is the story. This is what you're going to get with the Soviets. So then Nikita Khrushchev's like, okay, I can't let this happen. In come the tanks, and there go the events of Nights of Fire.
Yeah, so one thing that was interesting about reading the book, though, was that, so when you play Days of Ire, it doesn't feel quite as violent as Nights of Fire, I would say, in some ways, because Nights of Fire, you really have your guys getting wiped out and not coming back, and it's just these impossible odds. Whereas because of that pandemic-y feel, Days of Ire doesn't quite feel as bloody. It feels like crisis management, but it doesn't necessarily feel like war in the same way. But reading those accounts makes you think about how bloody it all was, all from the start. There are weapons and shootings and bombings and everything involved right from the beginning. And it's all just one huge, messy story arc.
And especially when it comes to the Nights of Fire, the second phase where the Russians decide to bring the tanks in, I mean, it almost has the same effect as the Tiananmen Square incident happened for China, where now you have these protests and you're seeing tanks literally in the street, rolling over people, gunning people down. I don't think that TV played a role here, but this is one of the points that the rulebook appendix made, that if anybody had any doubt, and there were some influential Marxist thinkers that was like, oh, well, the Soviets aren't that bad. They're trying something new. And if you had any doubt that this was really violent, then the Hungarian Revolution and the way it was squashed kind of put the emphasis on that, because it was just once the Soviet tanks went in, it was a complete wipeout.
Absolutely. Yeah, the Hungarians stood no chance once that happened.
So then, yeah, I mean, and it's funny to kind of end on that note, but that's where the game leaves you.
Yeah, and I kind of think games like that are important because we don't... one thing I like about board games in general is that they provide such an interesting medium to teach you about aspects of history that you might have not heard much about, that might have been forgotten in your history class, that matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, so I think we covered everything. Do you think there's anything, or is there anything from your readings that you wanted to jump in with either game?
No, I think I pretty much said it, but it's worth reading about. And, I guess the one thing I would add is that, here in the United States, we think of ourselves as people who help, right? And the Cold War was very much about, oh, let's go help all these people oppressed by communist regimes. We ignored Hungary.
Right.
We didn't do anything.
Yeah, I didn't get to that part where there was actually, as the revolution was going on, there was this expectation that the world leaders in the West would actually help. So Eisenhower was president at the time, and when Imre Nagy called for ceasefire, some of the revolutionaries they're actually keep going because they're thinking, we got to keep the pressure up because eventually the West is going to come and help us, and we're going to come to a whole new point. So who knows what could have happened? I think the Russians had every reason to kind of do what they did anyway, but they had all this cover and they were able to justify going in because the rebels didn't stop because they expected the West to come in and help them, and they didn't. And it's the West took notice. Like you actually had, I think the Hungarian freedom fighter was like the person of the year in 1956.
They were. That's absolutely true. In Time magazine. Mm-hmm.
And Nikita Khrushchev was person of the year in 1957, which is what are you guys doing?
Yeah. Yikes.
I can't believe this. The West definitely took notice, and I think that it kind of shaped the intellectual history. So you go into McCarthyism, you go into that's where you get the real demonization of communism. And, the story's not over. Like, who's one of the leading candidates for president? A democratic socialist. And the idea of socialism is still kind of in the air, but it's soaked with the memory of what the communists did and something like the 56 revolution. So that's why it becomes really important to know this stuff. It's not just a curiosity. Parts of it are relevant for how we understand ourselves today,
Yeah, those echoes are still here now.
All right, so hopefully we will get more games. I have a couple of cooperative historical games. I need more of them. Give me all sorts of time periods, and give me and Liz more grist for the historical mill. I definitely have a lot of fun with these. I know that most of the listeners have tuned out by now, but if you are maintaining this in your ear holes, then thank you so much. Liz and I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Come nerd out with us.
All right. So until next week, go ahead and grab a game off of that shelf and let's make every night a game night.
Happy gaming, y'all.